Linda's home resting and doing well. And then, sorry, I had a follow-up with my doctor this afternoon, and I've made good progress on my sugar management. I've gone from an 11.3% A1C, projected A1C as of today based on readings from a monitor, about 6.5, which is still in the diabetic range, but
Big difference.
I have a good chance of hitting my 6 month mark where I don't have to do much medication. So I appreciate the prayers and encouragement and everything.
That's a same goal. He said he's not where he wants to be yet, but he's lost a lot of weight.
All right, I'm gonna have David's gonna lead us in a song, and then we'll get going here.
Please turn to number 531. Number 531. Love, love. 531.
Love, 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 the gospel in us is love. Love thy neighbor as thy brother. Love, love. Peace, 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 peace. The gospel in a word is peace. Peace that passes understanding. Peace, peace, peace. Joy, 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 joy. The gospel in a word is joy. Joy that fills to ever flowing. Joy, joy, joy. Christ, 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 Christ. The gospel in a word is Christ. Love him, serve him, and adore him. Christ, Christ, Christ.
Lord and Father, we are ever thankful for many ways that you have blessed us today, and we ask that you will continue to be with us this evening in our studies. Help us as we strive to learn from the wisdom of Solomon and to better understand your word. Please, Lord, be with those that have been mentioned and many who are on our prayer list, especially for Betty's family and their loss, and for the shepherds and their loss. We pray, Father, that you will be a comfort to them at this time. We ask that you will continue to be with the congregations here in Ashland and the work that we're trying to do, and letting your light shine to this community and to draw those closer to you as we demonstrate your love. We ask all of these things in Christ's name. All right, so we kind of talked about Proverbs last week. So now we move to the book of Ecclesiastes, and I kind of mentioned that a lot of commentators believe that the different writings of Solomon represent different times in his life. The Song of Solomon has a very obviously youthful, I'd say lustful, but not necessarily in a wrong way, because it does seem to be focused upon a husband and a wife, but again, a youthfulness to it. Then you have the Proverbs likely collected throughout his life. And then Ecclesiastes is considered to be probably the later thing that he wrote, maybe the last thing that he wrote, as it kind of summarizes a lot of the experiences that he had in his life. It can be somewhat of a depressing read, especially when you think about the fact that the most used word in the book is vanity. And the phrase that accompanies it is vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That's kind of a bleak outlook on life. If Solomon were living today, we would say he was a nihilist. That is somebody who believes that there is no point in anything, based on that statement. But he does use it somewhat in a exaggerated way, and we'll talk about that. But it is a very beautiful piece of literature. It's not solidly poetic as most of the other wisdom literature is. It has sections where it kind of bounces between prose and poetry. But it is still very much in that fitting search for wisdom. It begins in chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And that is where we get our title for this book. Ecclesiastes is the Greek equivalent to the Hebrew word for preacher. And it's where we get the same base as the word for the church of ecclesia. So again, it has all of these ties to it. The author seemingly identifies himself as Solomon, like anything that has to do with the Bible, and especially the more ancient writings. Somebody out there, I'm sure, has a different idea, but I have yet to see any proof or any argument away from Solomon that honestly holds any water whatsoever. So, but the fact that he identifies himself as the son of David, king of Jerusalem, obviously that doesn't specifically mean Solomon, as any of the following kings would have identified themselves as the son of David because it was a Davidic line. But again, no reason not to think that this is Solomon. These are the reflections of somebody who has tried everything. Quite literally. Solomon was in a unique position. He had an abundance of power, an abundance of wealth, an abundance of peace, and he put his hand to pretty much everything that a human being can put their hand to in a search for the meaning of life. That's essentially what this book is about. It deals with a lot of questions. It deals with a lot of things that people still struggle with. I mean, even it's a statement that there's nothing new under the sun, even as this is written almost 1,000 years BC. So, not surprising, I guess, that people are still struggling with some of these same things. The next, I mentioned already, vanity, used a lot, and especially that phrase, vanity of vanities. Another key phrase is under the sun. He talks about under the sun meaning basically anything you can do on earth.
So, may I ask a question? So when you, talk about it, try everything, is it sort of an intellectual investigation of things, or was it a practical investigation of things?
It seems to be both. So the book begins, and even in verses 12 and following, he says that he set his mind to seek and explore, verse 13, to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. So in that, he tried to gather all the wisdom that he could, try to be a student of everything, in essence. And again, came to nothing as far as searching the human wisdom of especially his day. Then in chapter 2, he talks about the futility of pleasure and possessions. Chapter 2, verse 1. Come now, I will test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself, and behold, it too is futility. He tried to indulge himself in every way he could think. And of course, 700 wives is certainly one way to indulge yourself, right? Now, I will say, as we mentioned previously, most of those were actually political marriages. They weren't necessarily for the sake of actually having a relationship. But so he also sought to be very wealthy. He sought to, again, try to amass wealth and see if having stuff, as I've said before, fill that God-shaped hole. Essentially, what he tried to do is fill it with everything he could. Then in chapter 2, verse 18, he speaks of the futility of labor, that is, building things. Now, I don't necessarily think in this particular instance that Solomon necessarily was out there, laying brick alongside of people, but we do have some evidence that Solomon had things built, unlike a lot of other kings. There are a number of different things. David had not only his house built, but a tower called Shiloh. Of course, the Egyptian pharaohs built entire cities and pyramids and things that we can still see today. They're now lost to time, but Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens of Babylon and various other things. And so Solomon seemingly attempted to kind of follow suit. And then he also looks into some of these other things. He looks into relationships with individuals. He continues to look, and he revisits things as well. He comes back to the folly of riches, and he comes back to a few things. And he comes back even to the idea of governorship or in his position of having power. And he talks in a section about people being oppressed in verse 4 and verse 1 and following. He looks into people being oppressed, even trying to relieve that, or whether being the oppressor is really all that good or not. And he ultimately comes to the conclusion, of course, in chapter 12. Chapter 12 and verse 13, the conclusion, when all has been heard, fear God, keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. Ultimately, he comes back to the fact that without God, life does not happen. Because without God, we have no hope for our future, right? without God, as he talks about some of these things, whatever riches you acquire are going to be somebody else's. Without God, whatever you have built, whether it's a job, a company, actual physical structure, again, it's going to be left in the hands of someone else, and who knows what that person's going to do with that. It's certainly not going to be in human wisdom. That, we talked about some of those things last week, that some of the things that everybody was convinced were the truth, and we now look back on them and realize, no, well, certainly not the truth, right? Whether it's the Earth-centric view of the universe or the flat Earth thing has come back. Why? But again, all of these things, it just comes back, as Solomon kind of tried out and learned. It all comes back to the fact that you have to have God in life. If you don't, everything is vain, because ultimately it's going to pass away or pass to someone else. They say you can't take it with you.
Jared, I'm a little bit lost. You mentioned verse 4. When you talk about chapter 4, I can't find my place. I got the conclusion. But you said he comes back to, and then you said verse 4. Are you talking about chapter 4? Then I return to consider version.
Well, he returns, for example, to the folly of riches in chapter 4 and verse 10.
Okay. Thank you.
So, like I said, if you just picked up Ecclesiastes without knowing anything about it and just started reading from chapter 1 and verse 1, you could get pretty depressed by the time you get to the end of the book. As he just lists off all of these things that we so often associate, success with. Whether it's, again, the amassing of knowledge, the amassing of riches, the amassing of things, or leading a pleasurable life. Right? I mean, there are entire philosophical schools that are dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure. And over again, he just comes back to that statement: everything is vain.
So I follow up with another question that's parallel to the first one. The first one I asked is an intellectual exploration or practical, and we said it's both. I think that's right. What you presented. Were the things that he pursued all, well, I'll say righteous things or non-sinful things, or did he also pursue sinful things? And the reason I ask that is because so many people on earth, want to eat, drink, and be merry, and enjoy the sin now, because we're not going to be able to do that. Yeah.
Okay, so for those that are online, the question was, did he pursue only righteous things, or did he also pursue sinful things? And I would have to say that he also pursued sinful things. Just his sheer number of wives in itself was sinful, because one of the things actually that the law specified for the kings was that they were not to amass, also they were not specifically to seek to amass large amounts of money. Army things, specifically it mentions horses and chariots. So again, the idea of trying to amass an impressive army, physical army. He was not supposed to amass lots of wives, and he certainly was not supposed to marry foreign wives. We also know from Kings and Chronicles that those wives led him astray into even building high places and temples for some of the pagan gods that his wives believed in. And so it would seem that he sought whatever he thought was going to fill that hole that he was feeling in his life, whether it was acceptable to God or not.
Or let's test it out and see what comes of this.
Mm-hmm. yeah, I mean, 700 wives and 300 concubines, you know, he's certainly not looking for love. And again, the 700 wives, the vast majority of those were political in nature, but 300 concubines potentially were just a part of his search for pleasure. Not unlike his own father, saw a pretty girl and liked her and made her his wife. Or uncle. But ultimately, he comes back again to the fact that we need to serve God. And he even kind of adds to that if you look at chapter 12, that chapter 12, verse 1, remember the Creator in the days of your youth before the evil days come and the years draw nigh. You say, I have no delight in it. He's not unlike what we see in the book of Proverbs. He's kind of writing a cautionary tale here. Don't do what I did. There's no point to it. Almost, seemingly as though Solomon is kind of feeling some remorse, some lost years there, so to speak, as he chased all of these vanities, only to come back to the fact that he should have done what his dad told him to do, which was serve God and keep his commandments. Because that was all, remember, if we remember back to 2 Samuel, when God tells David that he's going to establish his kingdom, one of his things was, if your sons walk in my ways, I will bless them. So that was kind of one of those things. And, okay, to their credit, they did better than the southern, or than the northern kingdom, but that's not really saying much. There was 5, 6 good kings in all of the years of Judah. I mean, that's 5 or 6 more than Israel had, but still not exactly a high. But ultimately, it comes down to, again, him trying to kind of wax poetic and offer a warning to those that might think that Solomon, man, he lived a life. And I think it's kind of interesting because there's so many people that, again, have lived those types of lives. I find it interesting, for example, how many rock stars from when I was growing up, whether it was Alice Cooper or you guys are familiar with this band called Beastie Boys, rock, hip hop. But there are people that they have publicly come out and said, some of the stuff I did when I was younger was dumb. I really wish I had never done that. I really wish that I hadn't done that. Now, I always find that interesting. These people, they go out and they try and chase after things that maybe they shouldn't be chasing after, and then later in life, it kind of comes around and, okay, there's something to, being in fire life, or not being somebody who's always after controversy or what have you.
Well, this is one of those things where, for people at various stages of life, I've often said, in a few years, you're going to look back on yourself and say, this choice that you're making right now is not the right choice. Don't wait until that time. Make the good choices now. And that's a variety of things. Just teach ninth grade in high school, pull out a little mock soapbox and stand up and say, choices you make right now are important. And I said, one of them is education. I said, you may not think it's important now, but I guarantee you, when you have your first kid, then you're going to realize how important that education is. Don't wait until then. Make your choice now. Or any number of things. And I even say it to our grandkids, you may not like this food right now, but in a few years you're going to look back and say, why didn't I eat that food right then? So.
Oh yeah, there's so many things that I wish I could go back and, grab myself around the shoulders and, shake some sense and be like, wear hearing protection, you work in really loud places. Just for one, but, yeah, it's one of those things, probably my favorite quote along those lines was from Brother Rick Runback. He was the director when I was at school preaching, and now he's the dean of the School of Theology at Breed-Hardeman. But he once said in a sermon that wild oats are the only crop that people sow hoping for a failure. Okay.
Yes, agree.
And yeah, it's part of youth. I mean, that's one of the reasons that the Bible speaks so much to youth, right? Whether it's Paul telling Timothy, to flee youthful lusts, or Solomon trying to tell his son, to seek after wisdom in his youth, or to seek after God in his youth, and these types of things that when we're young, we think we're going to live forever, and our bodies can do a whole lot more than they can now, so to speak. I still don't know how I used to go out with friends until midnight, 1 in the morning, and then turn around and have to be at work at 7 in the morning. Yep, you're good. For that matter, I don't know how I think I did the math, and I think I only averaged about 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night at school of preaching. I don't know that. So.
That's why I had a heart incident in hiking school, 4 hours of sleep. I think you still needed straight A's.
Yeah.
In life in general. Can I ask a question on chapter 12, verse 6? I should know what it is referring to. Before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher shattered in the fountain.
Okay, yeah, so the question for those online is Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 6. Remember him before the silver cord is broken, the golden bowl is crushed, and the pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel of the cistern is crushed. So if you look at verse 7, dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God as he gave it. He's utilizing different poetic descriptions of death.
It's interesting, silver cord is loose.
Well, maybe most famously, the Greeks believed that. They believed that the fates had scissors, and when it was your time, they would cut your cord. That was when you died. Although they didn't originate with the Greeks, but they're the ones that most people associate it with, because we study the Greeks more than we study a lot of more ancient civilizations. But yeah, in all of those things, he's just using poetic terms for death. If he was writing today, he might say, buy the farm, kick the bucket. All right. So I would encourage you to give Ecclesiastes a shot, remembering that he's not just trying to make life sound horrible and pointless. He's saying that life without God is horrible. And I think we can all agree with that.
I think it's sort of like the Bible overall, but it's saying, as you're pointing out, learn from the experience of others. You don't have to experience it yourself. And that's always an interesting one, because the younger we are, the more likely that we're going to have to learn by experience. But as we grow and mature, then we can learn in other ways and learn from the experience of others. But that's what, to me, the book is about, and what the overall Bible is about.
No, I agree. Yeah, the urging by Solomon to try to learn from the example as opposed to having to try everything for yourself. if we took some of the advice of wise people like Solomon and other wise people in our lives who try to tell us those things, it makes you wonder how many fewer graduates there would be of the School of Hard Knocks, right? It's far too often we bring some of those things upon ourselves as the one of my favorite sayings is everything happens for a reason, and sometimes that reason is because you made a stupid choice. Well, let's talk about Song of Solomon. It is one of those books that we tend to shy away from. It's actually a book that some have claimed doesn't even belong in the Bible. Because subject matter is very personal in nature. It has to do with, it's kind of a call and response between a bride and her husband. And, there are some things in it that it does get somewhat risque at times, at least when you unwrap the metaphor. But again, when we think about the fact that God created humanity, as he said, created them male and female, right? And he intends for us to find a mate. Even as he showed Adam that there was not a suitable mate among the animals, he gave Eve to Adam as his helpmeet. So we are tasked in a way, I don't necessarily think it's a command, but we are social beings. We are created by God to not necessarily be hermits up in the woods all by ourselves. The only outlet for some of those feelings, those desires, those lusts, the only outlet is within the confines of a godly marriage. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Song of Solomon, and I've known several preachers that have intentionally, done sermon series on Sundays just to put it out there in front of people, because a lot of times we shy away from it. It's not a book that is at the top of very many people's reading lists. It is probably, of all of the books of poetry, it's probably the most poetic. That is, it's the least straightforward. It's a lot of metaphor. It is a lot of innuendo, things of that nature. But there is something very beautiful even about the love that is expressed between, a husband and a wife, and there is certainly nothing wrong with it. A lot of the objections to the book, even from within, what we might say Christian circles, kind of comes from, I believe, from a misunderstanding. And it's this misunderstanding that marriage is, for example, only for the bearing of children, or something of that nature. But it's not simply for that. There is companionship, and there is, again, the emotions, the love, and all of those things. It's all part of that relationship, and of course, it's a singular relationship. It's supposed to be the only place that we seek to find this type of fulfillment. So, in that way, of course, it's a very beautiful book. And, I don't know that using some of these phrases on your significant other is really going to get a lot of traction. But certainly the demonstration of showing appreciation for the other person, that's absolutely something that I think every marriage can benefit from, is, taking, and then when we think about it, these were potentially, love notes, love letters sent back and forth, and so, the back and forth of both of them showing that appreciation for the other, and not just physical. Yes, there's a lot of, physical, representations here and things, but it's also about just in general, the relationship that they have and the love that they have for one another, and the joy that they find in having found one another. And so again, this is why so many people believe that this was probably one of Solomon's earlier writings. And probably an indication that at least one of those 1,000 marriages was, I guess, what we might call the real deal. Although I will put out there, I presented this initially in the way that I tend to approach the book. That being said, there are a couple of dissenting ideas. One of them being that this is a collection of love letters sent between Solomon and a bride, but not his bride. I don't know how they come to that. And then the other dissension that's popular is that this isn't Solomon at all, that he may have collected these things and he may have put his name on it, chapter 1, verse 1, but he was not necessarily actually involved in this relationship, so to speak. I don't see any merit to those other interpretations or approaches, but they are out there and they're popular enough that I felt that I needed to mention them before just moving forward any further. But ultimately, I go with the fact that, again, Solomon says in chapter 1, verse 1, that he wrote this, and there's not been, until some of the more recent scholarships, and when I say more recent, I mean in the last 400 years, but when you're talking about a book that's nearly 3,000 years old, that's pretty recent. There's been little to no objection to Solomon being the author or anything of the nature, so. But yeah, again, I think a beautiful book of poetry that certainly I would say most husbands could stand to learn from it. I don't know, I'm not a very poetic person, certainly not the guy in the rom-coms and things that's sweeping anybody off their feet. I love Kendall into picking me, so.
It's good, it's true confessions now.
Jared, I like the prefix in these old New King James Pew Bibles that we have, where it says allegory, it pictures Israel as God's betrothed bride. There, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead of you. References Hosea 2:19 and 20, and the church is the bride of Christ, as human life finds its highest fulfillment in the love of a man and a woman, so spiritual life finds its highest fulfillment in the love of God for his people and Christ for his church.
Yeah, certainly God utilizes the relationship, the marriage relationship heavily in both Old and New Testament, speaking about his people. In fact, as we're about to start into the prophets, several of the prophets have as a major theme Israel's idolatry being equated to adultery. And so again, God, in essence, you could say God performed the first marriage ceremony, and he certainly has a high regard for marriage, and even as the Hebrew writer says, there's nothing wrong even with the marriage bed as long as it remains undefiled. And so I'm not going to say that it's something that we have to, teach in kids classes, but it's certainly not a book that we have to be embarrassed is in our Bibles. I think it's certainly, again, searching for, this type of mutual relationship and respect and love and things is certainly more fulfilling than what so much of the world seeks after these types of relationships, right? I have a hard time seeing the Song of Solomon play out in somebody who, some of these celebrities are only married for 3 weeks.
This is only the second time I've ever heard in my history in church. Someone visited one of our lectures. This was assigned to someone in the same pulpit. The young preacher, talked about some stuff. So,
Yeah, and it's it's one of those books that, because I think, well, it's very singular in nature. I'm not saying that there's not theological things in there, even as we mentioned, God utilizes the relationship of a marriage heavily, and I think that the demonstration here within the Song of Solomon, speaking about that mutual appreciation and love and those types of things, certainly kind of ties to what God is expecting from His relationship with us. But yeah, I'll admit I've never preached or done an in-depth study from a Bible class standpoint of the Song of Solomon, just because it just fits such a narrow theme. I do think it would be really good though as a basis for a marriage seminar or something of that nature. And like I said, other preachers who maybe are just braver than I am have done it. And there's certainly nothing wrong with it. God did put it in, he recorded it in the scriptures. And again, I mentioned there are some who object to it being in the Bible, but again, that's very recent. There's no, no historical record, for example, of the Jewish rabbis ever trying to cut it out and throw it away.
Well, and when it references Hosea, chapter 2, it talks about, I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice. And the whole book of Hosea, God tells him to take a life of harlotry, because that's what the Israelites were doing to God. They were committing, and so to me, Hosea is a really sad book for Hosea. But for mankind to realize what God's people have done to God.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I guess we can start talking about Isaiah. I don't think 10 minutes or so is going to be enough time to really dig into this book. So, well, let's just start.
Let me ask this question.
Sure.
You mentioned about the priests and the rabbis and whoever. The teachings of Solomon, were they a big part of what happened in synagogue teaching and other kinds of teaching?
Well, they certainly would have been a part. I don't know how much the Song of Solomon specifically would have been brought out, but they certainly were expected to know what was in these texts, in the same way that they were expected to know what was in the prophets and the law itself. So I would say that they were utilized. I wouldn't be able to venture much of a guess as to if they were utilized more than any other book. But
Because really what I always hear is about the Torah, and that's about all I ever hear about. That's,
and there was a heavy focus, for example, the books of Leviticus and potentially Deuteronomy would have been read essentially every year out loud on the Day of Atonement. That was part of the ritual, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so, certainly the law itself would have been important, and revisiting those things and those types of things. But again, I go back to the fact that God inspired its addition to the Bible, and we have a responsibility to utilize it like we would other texts. Again, I think the Proverbs were probably, or most certainly used in everyday life. How much they read them out loud in the synagogues and things, it's hard to say. But I mean, I could definitely see Ecclesiastes, featuring in a lot of classes, discussions, sermons, whatever word you want to put to it.
well, for us, we use Proverbs a lot and Ecclesiastes a lot. There's a lot of
Yeah.
those words.
Yeah, absolutely, and again, we're right to do so. All right, so let's talk about Isaiah. Well, let's just, before we start talking about Isaiah, let's talk about what this turning of a page means in our Bible. We now shift out of the wisdom literature, out of the poetry, with the exception of Lamentations, which, as I mentioned, often in the Hebrew Bible is moved to this area because it is a song, it is poetry. But here we have the works of the prophets. And we have in our minds, we often draw a distinction between the first books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. We call those the major prophets, and we call the others minor prophets. There's no distinction in Hebrew. The other problem with that is that Daniel's actually not very long, and Zechariah is. Some have made that statement, oh, it's because they're so much longer. Like I said, not necessarily.
Well, maybe it's because, you can kind of get a story out of Daniel, a lot of stories that we know, and the other ones, it's just all bad news.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Isaiah and Jeremiah are certainly, there are two longest books outside of Psalms. And Ezekiel is also quite lengthy, at least in page number. The only real argument that I have against the major prophet, minor prophet, is that I believe that it's given some people an impression that, for example, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel are more important than the others, and they're just not. In fact, if you go amount of prophecy, for example, if you go amount of messianic prophecies to total writing, Zechariah has more than Isaiah. It doesn't have more total, but a large portion of the book of Isaiah is not messianic in nature. Almost the entirety of Zechariah is messianic. And so again, we also have to throw in here that some of these prophets were working at the same time. And God wouldn't do that if one of their messages was less important than the for example, Ezekiel and Daniel were operating essentially at least for a time at the same time. As, for example, as were Ezra and Nehemiah, for that matter. Both of those men also, not necessarily prophets in this way, but in this way of writing a book like these ones, but certainly given to inspiration and holding a special place in God's story and his history. That being said, we also have to, it's also worth noting that there are a lot of prophets mentioned in, for example, Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, that some of them played very significant roles, but they just didn't write a book as we have it here. I think specifically some obviously very notable prophets would be Nathan, Samuel. Samuel wrote a book, but not like these ones. And there are even some unnamed prophets that, of course, Elijah, that was the other one I was going to mention, that a very significant prophet, he just didn't write a book. And then there are some of these other prophets that we wouldn't probably even know their name, except for God inspired them to write a book. So just kind of an interesting thing. One of the things that often we think of when we think of the word prophet is foretelling the future, but that's actually not what the word prophet means. The word prophet literally just means to speak forth or to say towards. And when you look at the writings of most of these men, they were dealing more with the everyday struggles of the people of their day than they were telling the future. By a staggering amount of pages, they dealt more with the problems that the people that they were serving and working with experienced than foretelling the future. That being said, obviously, the foretelling the future thing, it's important. It's one of the strongest evidences for the inspiration of the Bible. And so it's certainly something that we can't ignore, but we shouldn't think that the prophets, whether any of these men that wrote these various books or any of the others that I mentioned, always have their head in the clouds looking hundreds of years into the future. That only goes so far when you really think about impacting people's lives. Because we don't do a very good job of looking super far into the future, right? I mean, we might make plans, we might plan vacations and things like that, but we don't usually plan much more than a couple of years, maybe 5. And even then, your classic 5-year plan is usually pretty rough. It doesn't usually have, solid landmarks, mileage markers, and things like that. And so when we really think about the work that these men were doing, that probably better associated would be what we would call today a preacher. They spoke to the people about what they needed to hear, and then occasionally God would give them a message that was still for the people that they were speaking to, but maybe not their lifetime. That being said, the other major thing that we have to do with these books is remember that they were not written for Christians. They were written for the Jewish people of the day that they were written. They do have benefit for us, as does all of the Old Testament, but I've seen far too often where people kind of in a similar way that people try to drag Old Testament things into the New Testament, too often people try to push New Testament things onto the Old Testament or give the impression that, Isaiah or any of these other men were writing with us in mind as much as they were the people of their day, and that's just not true. Their mindset was almost entirely on the people of their day, even if they were foretelling things that were going to be far in the future. Because again, the emphasis of all of the Old Testament, the emphasis of Judaism was teach your children. So by giving a few of these kind of spread out, interspersed, it's peeks into future events, the idea was tell your children about this so they can look for it, and then they tell their children to look for it, and they tell their children to look for it. And then ultimately, most of those things came true. A lot of the things that they spoke about, even that were foretelling the future, a lot of times came true during the times of their writing. You know, whether it's, for example, Isaiah making prophecies about Hezekiah and his dying and being well and those types of things. And then ultimately, most if not all of the prophecies of the Old Testament were finished and fulfilled either by the time of Christ or by Christ himself. Because then he begins offering new prophecies, of course, a new people and a new hope. And that's about it. Unless there's comments or questions, we'll begin looking at the prophets. It looks like next week, but I thought it was important to kind of talk about the prophets as a whole, as a group, before we got into specifics. Anybody want to volunteer for the closing prayer? Yeah. Okay.
Continue to pray for, the Andersons, Matt family. Mark lost his dad, and then Elena's son. Just have to get the that we just really need to pray for Linda, her treatment today. So, anyway, if you join your word of prayers, we dismiss. Gracious and Heavenly Father, as we're about to leave this place in the course of our ways, just pray that you keep us safe until we assemble again. At the same time, you pray that you give all those that are in perilous, those that are in special need. This time, there's so many people that are close, near and dear to us that are special need, medical assistance. They have sicknesses and illnesses, and then again, those that have trials and tribulations that are going on. They're below the surface of everybody else. We just know that everybody has things going on in their lives. Just pray that you be with them in their struggle, and whatever it is. Again, I want to pray for this great nation. It's an election year. Just pray that we elect some worthy politicians. Pray that you be with our military forces, our first responders that always keep us safe. Just this great nation as a whole. We're just so blessed to be able to assemble here freely, be citizens of this country, but we look forward to that citizenship that we do have waiting for us up in heaven. We do your will. Heavenly Father, please be with those that I've mentioned on the prayer list, those that aren't on the prayer list, and each and every one of us, keep us safe until we assemble again. Pray this in your Son's name. Amen.